It's a real pleasure to be here. I wish David and others were here so I could thank them, but they'll just have to watch the video. I was drafted to chair this session a couple weeks ago. I'm not unfamiliar with some of the topics, but I'm not the kind of experts that the panel members are. I also discovered as the newly arrived chairman that the panel members all know each other from previous events. They probably went to school together, maybe to kindergarten together for all I know. And so I'm not so much an odd man out as much as my job is to get us rolling and queue up a few comments, and then I'll moderate the discussion going forward. The other thing I will say is that when I received the invitation to chair the panel, and I was told open society, impartial spectator, and misappropriation of technology, I didn't have to look up misappropriation of technology, but the other two required some attention, because I'd heard of the theory of moral sentiments, but I had not read it or spent any time with it. So I had to sort of dig into not so much the original material as critiques of the original material to figure out what Smith was talking about as an impartial spectator. And I think maybe Adam, at one point during an email exchange we had, said, oh, I did my degree in philosophy of something or other, and so but I'm not going to bring out all the stuff I know about Adam Smith. I said, good, because it'll just embarrass me. The one thing I think, though, it's worth noting is that the words impartial spectator communicate to all of us a sense of some external judge looking down on the world and being truly impartial in the same way you would think of a grand master or somebody who sits on top. But from Smith's perspective, the search for the impartial spectator was a search for his human conscience, is what I would say. How does he feel about this? And it's important to remember that a large portion of Smith's thinking about this was both what he thought about his own actions and his own participation in economies, and about others. So you see that this impartial spectator is very, very culturally dependent in Smith's definition. I mean, if you read the way that Smith thought about the actions of others or his own actions, he was, as I put it in a note to my colleagues, very Christian, very Calvinist, and very much, in my father's words, very much a Scotsman. You know, parsimonious, you know, no greed, reinvest, you know, very much, and those moral sentiments were sort of the bedrock of the way he thought about the world, and I think characterized the way he wanted markets to work and how an impartial spectator would look at the behavior of different market actors. If I think about open society, I have to not to go back to Adam Smith, but I have to go back to John Locke. John Locke, you know, developed this idea of a social contract and established the relationship between the citizens and the government. And it's very different than what we see now in many authoritarian countries. You know, in John Locke's terms, the individual has rights and they are loaned to the government. But those are rights that belong to the individual, not to the government. And the authoritarian governments don't have that same approach. And so vast portions of the world have never lived in what we would call a liberal democracy. And we've seen the evolution of liberal democracies in our world pretty substantially since the time of Locke and later Smith. Having set that sort of stage aside, what we're talking about is the liberal democracies and the question of fair behavior in the global economy, judged by an impartial spectator, maybe not Adam Smith's impartial spectator, but one that we ourselves would think about. So as we started the email interaction among the panel members, I laid out what I thought was a central tension, which is the scientific revolution, which was before Smith and laid the foundation for the Enlightenment, was really an open access kind of environment. You know, Isaac Newton didn't try to contain the calculus. A lot of what was going on in the scientific norms of the 1500s and 1600s plays out through what we see in universities today. Knowledge is the common heritage of mankind. You don't really worry so much about protecting the intellectual property because basic science and much of engineering is, you know, available to the world. And so I thought, well, hey, the tension here is between that norm of the scientific community and the norm of the marketplace, where you have to have some protection of intellectual property for the purposes of economic growth, development, and profitability. And over the course of about 5 days, the other panel members said, well, maybe that's not the central tension. Maybe it's the central tension is between public goods and private goods, and how we think about technology in those two contexts. And then another one came up, well, maybe it's between access to goods or access to technology and incentives for development. So I'll let the other panel members lead us off into those discussions. What I will do as we start moderating the discussion is I'm going to try and bring us back to 3 real institutions that are affected by the question about how a government or laws look at the appropriation or misappropriation of technology. One is research institutions, research universities in particular, which are on the open spectrum, right? The second one would be government R&D investments. So the National Science Foundation in the United States, EPSRC, DOD, DOE, NIH, the places in the world where government is the primary or lead investor or major investor in the development of science and technology. And how do we feel about appropriation or misappropriation in that context? And then the third one is corporate R&D, which is in some ways the most bewildering, because the corporate R&D environment is a global environment already. You know, Microsoft and Amazon have their AI research groups in Cambridge, UK. Merck and Honeywell are set up to do research in Shanghai. There was a big announcement, I believe, that a Canadian company is setting up a big collaboration with UCSF in San Francisco for certain types of biological research. So we are accustomed to companies operating across borders in their R&D activities that include both what we would think of as liberal democracies and those things which we think of as authoritarian regimes. So I sort of missed the absolute first thing I said to all my panel members, please introduce yourself when you stand up. I didn't. My name is Bruce Guile. I apologize, that's coming at the end of my talk. I've spent 25 years, after 15 years at the Academy of Engineering, I spent 25 years running a management consulting firm that deals mostly with R&D strategy around the world. So all of these institutions that I'm talking about are ones that I'm touched or familiar with on the R&D side, is what I would say. With that, we're going to go in the order here. Christopher, do you want to introduce yourself and take over?
Well, thank you to the organizers for making this possible and for you for joining us today. My name is Christopher Hugh. I am a professor, the Chestnut Professor of Law, but also hold appointments in the Engineering School and in the Communications School at the University of Pennsylvania, where I lead the Center of Technology, Innovation, and Competition. And I'm delighted to be here to revisit Adam Smith, because I was taken back 36 years. And in my sophomore tutorial, this is the first book we read. Actually, it was we read Hannah Arendt first, which has got new relevance. I thought was becoming irrelevant at the time, and has a new relevance, unfortunately. But it's a foundation piece of a program called Social Studies, and I even unearthed the paper I wrote back in 1983. So it's been a bit of a journey for me, and it's something that I've really enjoyed doing, and to revisit some ideas. And my job here, I guess, is to start to introduce some basic ideas and to get the conversation started. By orienting us, my goals are twofold, is to put us into the modern context of how we think about technology, appropriation, and openness, and then actually see what, if anything, Smith has to say, what we can learn from going back to Smith in terms of figuring out how we think about this. So there is a very well-known, the basic idea behind intellectual property is that think of an idea like a patent is once it can be created, it can basically be shared with an infinite number of people without really diminishing the availability for anybody else. That's a concept in economics called non-rivalry. The other reality is it can be shared costlessly in this modern age with as many people as you like. The famous quote by Jefferson, I say it in full here, "He who receives an idea from me receives instruction himself without lessening mine. He who lights his taper at mine receives light without darkening me." And that's sort of the classic idea, is that once you have an idea, you can be shared with an infinite number of people and without costlessly. And this is really maps onto economic ideas about, traditionally we think about marginal cost pricing. If you price a true patent at marginal cost, which is zero, because you can reproduce it endlessly without increasing any costs, you would then price it at zero to get efficient allocation. Now there's a problem with that. If you price it at zero, it generates no revenue. You never cover the fixed costs it needs to create them. And so this leads to what has been known in the economic literature and the legal literature as what we call the access incentives trade-off, which is we accept some notion of intellectual property rights or some other protection to create the exclusivity needed to raise the price above marginal cost so that you can actually recover some of the fixed costs in a reasonable way. And what's interesting is we then calibrate intellectual property protection in different ways to actually find that right balance. So the way this is often discussed is in terms of the copyright term. Unlike other forms of property, we don't make it infinite. Real property is permanent. Here we have debates over what the proper length of the term is to calibrate the right incentives to give enough return to incentivize the creation to begin with. But it's not just the term. Intellectual property has many dimensions to scope as well, which is how broad the rights you get are protected in it become very much a part of the discourse. And unlike real property, which has a thing-like aspect to it, this is entirely the child of positive law, the statutory enactment and judicial interpretation of those statutes so that it can be calibrated in any way. So this becomes a multidimensional calibration to try to balance the two. And I think obviously you get academics together, people will frame it in different ways, but I'd say for the large part, academically debates are motivated by this paradigm and people twisting different knobs to make it go. So for this conference, what can we learn from Adam Smith? And particularly from the theory of moral sentiments in particular, and what I really found quite interesting is when they taught us this, they had us read the theory of moral sentiments before we read The Wealth of Nations, because Adam Smith really did see the same self-interested motivation that is typically, that gives us the main objective function in economics, he saw motivating moral behavior as well. And so in that sense, he reminds ourselves, and as David said this morning, he had his students read both books because he thought those two as intimately tied. And in the discourse as set up by this morning's conversations, in many ways, we're being invited by this entire conference to think about ways to make those ties more explicit, do it more self-consciously. And in that sense, I think Adam Smith's framing is extremely useful because he has a theory of why that's the case. And that theory really comes from this notion of sympathy that has been set up in the early materials, where it's basically you try to think of what this impact will be on other people. And this actually has a very modern valence to us today. So this is very much in the Kantian and the neo-Kantian tradition of John Rawls. He wrote an idea that we put people into what he called the original position. You don't know, you can arrange wealth differentials in society, but you don't know if you're going to be the janitor or the surgeon. And you have to say, in a world where you don't know who you're going to be, we understand surgeons have to earn a little bit more, or else there's no way they'd undertake the 8 more years of preparation to do that. And if without knowing who you're going to be in that lottery, you think that the difference is justifiable, fine. That is very much inconsistent with the Smithian idea of sympathy. And then, like Kant's categorical imperative, he said you should act in a way that the individual incentives generalize in all society. In other words, make every rule a natural law, and everyone in a coherent way makes it work very well. That's all very present as ways of giving content to the access incentive paradigm, which is we could put ourselves in the sympathetic original position and think, what kinds of returns do we think it would be justified to incentivize those actors? And we can calibrate that in the vacuum without knowing if you're going to be one of the consumers or producers of the knowledge base that we're talking about. Well, that's a nice first step. We get into another interesting idea very much present in Adam Smith's work, which is the notion of what we would call market failure. Now, from an economist standpoint, this is very familiar in some of the other panels we're talking about on corporate law, agency failure, that we have an outcome we like, but the managers have a disincentive that's different from the shareholders or the wealth as a company. You get a wedge, and therefore you see the corporation make different decisions. And in fact, what David's introductory papers, when he put it out, said it very nicely. There's a difference sometimes between self-interest can devolve into selfishness, where you see individual people's behavior not being consistent with the idealized, generalizable concept of sympathy, of what you construct and support, but would take advantage of your position to deviate from that in ways opportunistically that wouldn't work if it was generalizable to everybody, but could work in your individual situation. And in a really lovely passage, Smith actually divides it up into different classes and tries to see different actors to see how well they're disciplined by the sympathy response. And his notion was that lower and middle classes, because they depend on other people's resources to get things organized, and because they identify with the upper classes, will tend to sympathize with them and try to make their behavior consonant with everyone's expectations. His primary concern is there are people for whom they lack the accountability, that if they're not sufficiently held accountable, they could actually begin to act in ways that are contrary to the goals of the overall organization or society as a whole. And so you start to see that wedge between private incentive and public incentive in ways that are very familiar to the economic way of thinking, but here really colored by moral and sympathy. The last comment I'll make is there is a lurking problem that was put out very, very nicely in today's opening sessions, which is we really should be worried about dynamic efficiency more than allocative efficiency. The problem is our tools for actually understanding what those incentives, how that plays out, are remarkably bad. One of the most fundamental questions in innovation is what is the value of the year of the life of a patent? So how do we know that the optimal term is 20 years? Should it be 25? Should it be 15? Should it be anything in between? And with the answer to that question, we're just guessing. To my knowledge, there's no really good sound answer to those basic questions. Now we have a lot of micro knowledge and a lot of people doing great work, but it's not just that on term, it's all the different aspects and the understanding about how concentration in the markets leads to innovative behavior, and all this has been theorized by Arrow and Schumpeter and opposing conjectures, generated a massive empirical literature, which I think can charitably be called inconclusive. So what's interesting is it's easy to state up frameworks about how we could try to answer them, but to give content to the framework requires a lot of meta propositions, whether you're talking about straight economics or Smith, that we have not really developed adequately, and that remain the challenge for future scholars. Thank you.
Perfect. I'd like to take one question after each panel member, and then we'll open it up for general discussion. Does anybody have a particular question they'd like to ask Chris?
I actually go by Christopher. My wife is named Chris.
Okay.
Just a quick one.
Please.
It's been a long time since I looked at John Rawls. It's been a long time since I looked at John Rawls, years and years. And I had the recollection that original position puts us all back into the kind of formation of opinion that doesn't depend on our status or where we are. And it struck me that that's a little different than what we're hearing about Adam Smith's, what do we call it? Impartial Spectator, which seemed more dependent on the individual person and on culture, which to me I thought was more absent from Rawls. Yes?
So I actually think it's the reverse. Because actually, in theory, the construct should work both ways. But for those, if you look at the writing of Smith looking backwards, he actually believed that people shared common visions of sympathy and that it would converge to a single result. And in that sense, Smith has been criticized someone as not being a true liberal, in the sense not taken seriously enough that people's preferences could vary so widely that when you try to synthesize all these sympathetic positions into a global rule, that you end up with a coherent rule. And what you may see is some criticism of that. Now, Rawls didn't even get that far. He says, if you want to buy this construct, you have to buy into the construct before I'll start to think about how to work out the details. And it was much more agnostic about that as an idea. But there's a real question sitting under all of this, which is, even if you try to synthesize sympathetic positions, is it going to yield a single rule that everyone can abide by? And the answer in a true liberal tradition should be no. And then the real question then becomes is how do we create processes for reaching that where it becomes morally acceptable for people who disagree with the outcome, which is going to be some minority, significant minority, to find it substantively okay to live with that. And that's stuff that he doesn't get into because he's really Smith is really a natural law person and looking for roots and saw fundamentals of human behavior, the Calvinist aspect. He really thought that there was a true human nature and things that people should like better than others, and was not from the moral relativist tradition that now dominates the way we think now. So I thought he thought it wouldn't be it wouldn't have the coherence problem because he thought it would converge.
Thank you. Adam.
All right.
I think.
Yes, I'll start. We were directed to stand. So
stand to the side.
So we were asked to give a few remarks about who we are, and I will keep it very brief, if only because I always joke that as one goes through one's career, it becomes a bit like Game of Thrones, where you just kind of titles and things accrue to you, and as soon as you have a long list of professor of law and senior scholar and killer of dragons and Lord of the Andals. My name is Adam Mossoff, and I'm professor of law at George Mason University, Antonin Scalia Law School, and I specialize in intellectual property and property law with a particular focus on patents and trying to understand both historically, legally, and philosophically how patents have been defined as property rights within Anglo-American legal systems generally, and how that has driven economic growth and led to flourishing societies more generally. And so, as Bruce suggested, I have a long history with studying not just Adam Smith, but the Scottish Enlightenment and natural rights and natural law tradition more generally. I have a philosophy background in addition to being a tech geek. And I will not be using PowerPoint because I am a follower of Lord Acton's slightly less known famous dictum that if power corrupts, PowerPoint corrupts. Absolutely. So fight the power, and I will lead the way. So today I want to pick up on Adam Smith's incredible insight, the foundation of economics as a science, right? That division of labor and specialization is a key to maximizing value and leads to economic growth. Is his famous pin example in The Wealth of Nations made clear. And of course, the foundation for how you lead to or create division of labor in society and permit specialization is property. Property rights are the basis by which then people can divide up their interests between themselves, start to negotiate through transactions, through this starting to specialize, through this creating economic growth in a flourishing society. Now this insight about property applies just as much to intellectual property. In fact, Adam Smith recognized this. Although he recognized it in a book that has not yet, a text that's not yet been mentioned, and I didn't bring it because it's like that thick, and I didn't want to carry it on the airplane. But it's his Lectures on Jurisprudence, where he recognizes that intellectual property, particularly patents at that time, were property rights. Now, I also want to follow an aspect of his methodology as an Enlightenment thinker that hasn't been really addressed, which is that he was a core and empiricist. And he believed also in kind of a historical methodology. You look to the facts, you look to the historical development, you learn from that from that you induce and infer your principles and your insights about what constitutes the foundations for an open society and a flourishing society at that. And so intellectual property, we have a substantial several hundred years now in which intellectual property has been protected under laws of various countries and through treaties between countries. And it's always been controversial, even in the United States. From the get-go, it was extremely controversial. Christopher, you mentioned a very famous letter from Thomas Jefferson. He quoted from it about the lighting the tapper. Thomas Jefferson was very much, at one point in his life, a skeptic of intellectual property. Then he became less skeptical later, and then he became more skeptical again. But other people have always been, it's been a vibrant topic of debate, and not just domestically in the United States, but in other countries as well, and internationally. It's been a huge debate in international policy. But as an historical matter, it's really significant. The United States was the first country that took seriously the idea that intellectual property should be protected as a property right. As a property right, not as a privilege bestowed upon you by the crown or a gift from the government, but that it should be defined in the law and protected under the law as a property right to the first inventor, the first creator of an artistic work. And historians and economists who have studied the history of the development of the United States have identified the fact that this was a key part, not solely the only part, you can't reduce it completely to IP, but the key part in the explosion in innovation markets as inventors took their property rights into the marketplace and created new markets and engaged in the type of behavior that you expect to see with people who possess property rights. So for instance, you had development of licensing. Charles Goodyear, inventor of the process for vulcanizing rubber, had no connection whatsoever to Goodyear Tire and Rubber Company. It was created about 40 years after he died. He was your classic crazy inventor. He wrote a book, a 2-volume book about all the awesome things you could do with rubber. And to prove his point, he had it bound in rubber. And it's just for pages, it lists. You can make coats and umbrellas and boots and all. I mean, just the guy loved rubber. He didn't want to be a business person, and so he embraced the property right he had in his patent by licensing and transferring the interest to manufacturers and business persons and other people so that they could capitalize and embrace their special skills in those contexts, and that he could then receive an income stream and continue to do what he always wanted to do, which is experiment with rubber. And Elias Howe, the inventor of the lock stitch, a key component of the invention of the sewing machine. I'm known as the sewing machine guy in policy debates because I did a big historical study of the invention of the sewing machine. It was the 19th century smartphone. It led to something called the sewing machine war, a big patent battle in the 1850s because different people invented different components of it. Elias Howe, who invented the lock stitch, also licensed his technology. It also led to the development of what we now call the franchise business model. So Samuel Morse embraced his patent on the telegraph. He was a professor of art at NYU. He didn't want to get into the business of running a telegraph, so he transferred his interests and they engaged in a franchise business model. And of course, Alexander Graham Bell with the telephone. Now, what do these insights? Why do we care about this? Why do we care about these insights, these historical insights and stories? Well, as a preliminary matter, right? So Ricardo, right, extended Smith's insight about specialization within a country to international trade, right? He said countries can specialize and have comparative advantages. Some are strong with technology and innovation, others are strong with labor markets, and that they should trade between themselves. Well, as Christopher mentioned, intellectual property is a public good. It's easily copied, especially outside the legal jurisdiction in which it's protected. When patents are published, this is part of the quid pro quo. You publish your work in order to get your protection. And so what you end up with, therefore, is countries who have access to your technology through your patents that are public, right? And they think, well, it's not necessarily in our economic interest to respect this intellectual property because we're manufacturing the goods, because we have the comparative advantage and economies of scale and labor, so we'll just take your goods and do with it what we want to do, because this is what we need to do as a developing country. And this is where the point about the historical example of the U.S. matters, because the U.S. was itself a developing country in the 18th and early 19th centuries. We were primarily American. We were primarily an agrarian country. We were not known for innovations, and yet 60 years after we broke from Great Britain, we were marveling the world in the very first World's Fair, the Crystal Palace Exposition of 1851, with the sewing machine, the telegraph, vulcanized rubber, the mechanized reaper, the Colt repeating firearm, and many other innovations that were patented innovations that people had taken into the marketplace with their patents. In fact, a study by Steve Haber, a political scientist and economist at Stanford University, recently published an article called, interestingly enough, Patents and the Wealth of Nations, where he talks about how the United States actually had the same per capita GDP as Brazil in the 18th century. And it was only towards the end of the 19th century that we actually were starting to go beyond that. And other studies have repeatedly shown that intellectual property, even for developing countries, leads to increases in direct foreign investment in those countries, which is exactly what they need to shift from developing to becoming developed. In fact, China recognizes this. They are now developing a legal institution to protect reliable and effective property rights. In fact, VCs in the United States now say that Chinese or German patents are better patents than United States patents because we spent the past few years diminishing our patent rights through court, legal, and regulatory actions. So piracy on a international scale is as much a knowledge problem as it is a cultural or political problem, because the problem is that policymakers, especially in developing countries, don't know about this data and these studies that show that intellectual property is as important for them as it is for developed countries, and that they should develop the institutions to respect it and to protect it domestically for themselves just as much as developed countries respect it between themselves as well. Now, it can't do it alone. You need other things in addition to IP. You need the rule of law, stable political and legal institutions. So it's not true that you develop a patent system and your country will all of a sudden become a flourishing, growing economy. But it is a key factor, and it's just as much true for other types of interests, especially property rights, as it is for intellectual property. So thank you.
Thank you, Adam. We take one question for Adam, please.
Thank you, Adam. I find this very interesting, and I find that there's some really interesting kind of parallel paths that are completely contradictory. So you look at India, who says we're not going to recognize certain patent medications because we have to produce them at prices that our population can afford them, and companies like Pfizer would never do that. So forget it. We're going to ignore the patent. And as a society, I think that we struggle. Obviously, people from Pfizer don't. But we struggle. We say, okay, so is it inappropriate for these pharmaceutical companies to be gouging on their drugs in places like AIDS drugs in Africa, or different kinds of drugs, HPV drugs in India? And yet at the same time, we find it absolutely unacceptable if the same thing happens in China.
Yeah.
So how do we find middle ground here? And have you actually thought of a structure that would be fair?
That's a great question, and two responses. One is at the IP level, and another is at a more fundamental level. So with just respect to the IP issues, so that the patent owners, the pharmaceutical companies, aren't selling in India or in Africa at prices that can be afforded there. That's actually not true. And this is exactly what's made possible through having patents, is that they can engage in what economists call price discrimination by selling at lower prices in some jurisdictions than in others because of the ability of different people to pay in those jurisdictions. And they use the contract rights from their property rights to make that possible by saying you can't come bring it back and resell it at a lower price in the United States. And so they want to sell these drugs because they would need to make up their R&D. The average R&D, the most recent study that came out about a year ago, is that the average pill that makes it to market and is offered as a healthcare product has $2.6 billion of sunk costs and R&D behind it. And that's because they start, that one pill starts with 10,000 molecules that they first investigated, almost all of which were dry wells. It leads to ultimately about 500 potential molecules that then are potential candidates that then go through the regulatory process. So much of that 2.6 billion actually is the FDA testing process, especially phase 3, which is the human subject testing. And so so yes, it's very cheap to make that pill, but they've got to make up the 2.6 billion in order to continue to do the R&D that leads to those amazing pills. And they recognize that they will sell more cheaply in Africa and in India than they will in the United States because they can pay different prices at that level, and they use their patent rights to do that. And so India didn't make the choice that, oh, you're not selling it cheap enough. India is actually breaking the patents because they want to be the pharmacy for the developing world itself. They're breaking the patents not because they're providing cheap drugs to Indians, because the pharmaceutical companies do want to do that. It's not true that Pfizer doesn't want to. They don't make any money if they offer a pill for $100 and no one can buy it in India, right? So they want to, and every cent that they make is something that they make back that they can put back into their R&D, right? India has become the pharmaceutical pharmacy, has become the CVS or whatever pharmacy you have for the developing world because, hey, we're not going to respect the patents, so it's very cheap because we don't have 2.6 billion to make up for in recouping this. And that creates a fundamental economic problem because eventually the drug companies will say, well, we're not making enough money, we can't reinvest it in creating new pills. India, you're not going to have any more new pills to break patents on to sell to the developing world. Almost all of the medicines under the 100, actually I shouldn't say almost all of the medicines are the 100 essential medicines developed by the World Health Organization, identified by the world, are all off patent too. So it's not true that of the core medicines that people need for core treatments are under patent and they're being price gouged, and this is the problem. I want to just really quick, and then the last point is the more fundamental issue, is that in the developing world, the problem isn't prices. The problem is distribution facilities and infrastructure. I can't tell you, when you talk to people in the pharmaceutical industries, they actually ship, very oftentimes for free, massive amounts of quantities of medical treatments to developing countries, which then sit in warehouses and degrade and disintegrate and go to waste, because they lack the infrastructure and the political capabilities of the government, which are oftentimes, sometimes they're authoritarian and don't have an interest in helping their people, right? And distributing these medicines through the country. And so it's a much more complex problem than it's easy to say, oh yes, the drug companies are gouging everyone and that's why you have this problem and this is why developing countries are breaking the patents. But I think it's a much more complex political, social, and cultural problem than that.
I'm sure we'll be back at this in a different form or the same form later in the discussion. Tom.
Thank you very much. It's an honor to be here, and my name is Thomas Hazlett. I'm an economist at Clemson University in South Carolina, in the United States. And I believe I was invited here, perhaps, I don't know for sure, but I did co-author a paper with David Teese, and it was a terrific paper. I don't think any of you actually know it because it may be David Teese's only unpublished paper. And just in case you think it was just kind of neglect or even writer's incompetence, no, the paper actually was rejected at a journal. So I don't think that's happened a lot to David. Don't spread it around too much. I hope we can edit this, you know, just so David doesn't know that I was saying this. But anyway, well, that's pretty clear. Yeah, so the assignment here is to squirt a little lighter fluid on the coals of liberal thought in Edinburgh, and I'm happy to do it, and for the first time to wear my Adam Smith tie. So thank you very much for that opportunity. Thank you very much. I'll take any questions. I've been reading that's too long, the moral sentiments book, but and it doesn't travel. But this book travels, and I do want to recommend to you a 2019 book just out, Humanomics. Moral Sentiments and the Wealth of Nations for the 21st Century by Vernon Smith and Bart Wilson. And Vernon was invited, couldn't be here, but he, in his Nobel Prize acceptance, 2002, he toasted the Scottish Enlightenment, and he is a student of Adam Smith and really an expositor of moral sentiments and the wealth of nations. And let me just give you the short version I've learned really from reading Smith and Wilson, two great economists on this. So in moral sentiments, foundational, of course, for what comes later in what we now call economics, people do operate on grounds of self-interest, what in fact Adam Smith calls self-love. Yet this individualism is not rugged. It is social. And it is incessant other regarding behavior, that we're constantly interested in what people think about what we're doing and what we think about what they're doing. We're very interested in our passions and in theirs, and in resentments and gratitudes. And so it's the social interaction that really gives rise to all of our activities in society. And what comes later, of course, is the economic side of that. In The Wealth of Nations, Smith really did give us something that sounds so familiar today, because economics over 200 years has picked up this idea of spontaneous order in the market. What's interesting is that in the smaller groups, in our families, in our tribes, in our social circles, we do make judgments about people. We're constantly involved in other regarding behavior. And we take a lot of context into account in dealing with these individual people in those small transactions. But there's another side to our lives which is tremendously important, and Smith captured it so beautifully, and maybe too beautifully, because so many people forgot about what had gone before. But in The Wealth of Nations, the impersonal market and the specialization that gives rise to, for the first time really in human history, increasing incomes. We have incomes that are 30 or 40 times today greater than when Adam Smith wrote. And you say, well, of course, that's modern, that's what happens. No, not when Adam Smith wrote. That's a product of exactly what Smith was writing about, the opportunity to specialize, and in Smith's mind, because of the liberalization of rules and spontaneous order that resulted. Now, it's really interesting, these two sides of our lives, the close, the personal, the moral, and then the impersonal market. And we benefit, of course, from both. We live in both worlds. And there's conflict. There's even conflict between the two books that a lot of authors, there's a whole literature on that. But the important thing is how together they are in our personal lives. This is what Smith was writing about. And while economists certainly got basic ideas from the Wealth of Nations and ran with it, in fact weaponized it to formalize the optimization of the invisible hand, and in that mathematical treatment just sort of slipped in cash value and narrow self-interest, as though that were what Smith was talking about, which is pretty as close to an error as you can make and still get away with it for 200 years. And so that's there, but you know, moral sentiments are still alive, and economists have had to discover this too. And how have they discovered it? Well, they've discovered it in the trust game, and that's one of the little bonuses you get from Smith and Wilson. So you know the trust game? I don't know, you're not economists, you may not know the trust game that experimental economists have been doing since the 1980s. So you have people who know how to play games, not corporate executives who can never get these things right because they're too programmed, but college undergraduates who love money and are constantly on the screen. Anyway, you get them in there and you take 30 people here and 30 people there in 2 different rooms, you match them up anonymously, and you give, say, $50 to the first person in the pair and say, here, you can take whatever percentage of the 50 you like, and the remainder is going to go to somebody else, and we're going to triple it before it gets to them. And then that person who you don't know is going to get a chance. We're going to tell them what you did, and they're going to get a chance to give you some money back. So a lot of economists were astonished by the results of that kind of experiment and replicated, you know, hundreds, thousands of times. And it turns out people are not narrowly selfish. They will pass the money along, and they'll trust some anonymous person to maybe send money back. In fact, in the United States, they're close to 50-50 splits on how you end up with the money. In Russia, you get a lot lower for the second person. Okay, so there are different levels of trust, but Western Europe does pretty well on trust. A lot of economies come through pretty nicely, and guess what? It really does violate the narrow self-interest rule. It's Adam Smith's moral sentiments. People are not thinking, how can I just get that dollar? And can I trust that other person, and what do I think about that? And there's lots of other stuff that's happened. So that's an interesting conflict. And so the actual science turned out to disrupt the science, the economic science. And so we know how subtle Smith was as a thinker. Do I have slides or not?
Yep.
No, there we go. Okay. So I'd like to make just a couple more comments, and then I'll get the hook. So intellectual property, as part of the institutional background helping us cooperate in society, has always been controversial, and for reasons stated. I mean, the balance is a difficult question, and sometimes it even seems to conflict. You know, most, and I think Bruce said this, most of what we do in terms of intellectual property is not protected. In fact, a very small percentage of the ideas we get from other people are subject to any kind of intellectual property law. And I take that to make intellectual property even more important. It's got leverage. It's got power. It does produce so much. And in fact, I will cite 19th century Americans for saying this. It wasn't just in the Constitution. It was when we were a developing country in the United States, and we saw it actually work. And so, am I clicking through? Next. Does next say next? There it is. So Abraham Lincoln, patents, he was a patent, the only American president to have a patent. Said that patents added the fuel of interest to the fire of genius. And this idea, you know, by the middle of the 19th century, that this was working all over the world. There's controversy, countries sort of come in and come out, but it works. Through survivorship, we see how intellectual property. Now, this is a developing country. The United States, it could have been free riding, it could have been doing all kinds of, you know, what we think developing countries are supposed to do, but by the end of the century, as great a liberal and as great a disruptor, in many ways a vicious opponent of conventional wisdom, Mark Twain is telling you that the conventional wisdom has settled in my favorite novel, The Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, declared, the very first official thing I did in my administration was to start a patent office, for I knew that a country without a patent office and good patent laws was just a crab and couldn't travel any anyway but sideways or backways. So that was conventional wisdom in a developing country after 100 years of experience with something that's hard, intellectual property rights. Okay, so that's it. Now, so I'll finally say this. In the West, we're here to talk about this. In the West, maybe the system is breaking down. There are a lot of free riders in the international sphere, and they're manipulating markets, and they're playing with our laws. I hope we prosecute our laws. We don't have perfect places to prosecute, but I hope that where there is intellectual property at stake, that we bring new cases, and I hope the new cases make new laws. And if there are back doors, well, let's go in the front door and prosecute it. The rumors, the politics, the populism is not solving the problem. Tariffs are the technology of 1700, and I don't think they're effective in the fight in the 21st century. They're way beyond their due date. So let's also focus on getting the intellectual property rights correct in the capitalist countries. We're supposed to be flummoxed by the challenges, the sharing economy, open source software, two-sided markets. People are quite negative about many of these things, and I'm kind of mystified by that, because this capitalism thing is dynamic and it's flexible, and it nests amazingly diverse business models, and very disruptively. Now, it's always controversial. The balancing is, between investment and sharing is not obvious, and so we have to go through these things, and we have to have the occasional litigation. It's expensive and difficult, but by hammering these things out, certainly my bias is with Abraham Lincoln and Mark Twain. And I'll just give you the last, I just came across this the other day, and I was remembering and kind of giggling about this. So what was a great day in intellectual property rights was April 27th, 1986. What happened in America? There's a huge controversy in the United States about scrambling satellite video signals. Home box office, producing new programming that nobody had ever seen on television, was going to scramble its signal, encrypting it such that free riders could not take it, even though they had bought 7-foot wide satellite dishes and stuck them in their backyard. And so what happened was a folk hero was born, and his name was Captain Midnight. Oops, that's citation. There we go. Captain Midnight. So this is the day. As viewers tuned in to see a movie, they got that on the screen for 4.5 minutes. Good evening, HBO from Captain Midnight, $12.95 a month? No way. Showtime and the movie channel, beware. So this idea that you could own the signal you're putting out there and not have it appropriated was thought to be some kind of dastardly behavior. Now, this guy's a folk hero. Still today, he's a folk hero. There's a very widespread kind of thinking that this is controversial. But our world is swimming, not on 7-foot dishes, it's swimming on 4-inch screens, on flat panels in our homes. It's swimming in encrypted video. And it's a revolution, and the value creation is amazing, and this was where it started. It's 30 years ago. Now we live in a different world. Nobody talks about whether or not you can have digital rights management in this sense. But I think this is an interesting little object lesson. What is controversial and disruptive, sometimes we can spend 4.5 minutes on it and then move on. So I hope we do.
One question for Tom in his after his presentation, then we'll open it up to interactive dialogue here.
I'm afraid I'm going to encrypt the answer.
Please go ahead. No, please go ahead.
The floor is yours. It's in the public domain. Take it.
It's open access, obviously. There is no contested good here.
So I remember seeing an RSA talk where the guy said, you know, I was in business school and I said to my, somewhere in California, and I said to my prof, I've got this great idea for business and I'm going to get all of these people to work on my company for free. And we're going to develop all this software for free, and they'll work in their spare time, and we'll build something of value, and then I'll turn around and sell it. And my prof almost threw me out of class. And of course that is open source software. So, and now more and more companies, and we're seeing it all across the US and Canada for sure. I don't know as much in Europe, but we're seeing that companies are actually insisting on open source software as the methodology. So how does that impact the models, and what do you see the future being?
So, Christopher knows it. But the other book I bought, and you can tell that they're small paperbacks. I don't want to bring these giant things. Transaction costs being what they are. But there's a wonderful book by Eric Raymond, who's one of the great hackers of all time, and obviously a giant backer of open source software, the Cathedral and the Bazaar, the year 2000. And it's a wonderful explanation of how Lockean property rights underlie open source software. Now, there are all kinds of transactional efficiencies that do not involve exclusive ownership and payment of cash money. But there's, when you say free, there are lots of rules, and there are lots of manners, and there are lots of reputations, and in fact there's lots of people making their livelihood. Okay, so there are a lot of efficiencies that come there, but it's all nested in a property system, and sometimes it gets copyrighted, sometimes things get patented. But take the flip side of it. IBM gave away Unix code copyright. Just gave it away. Why? To create an ecosystem in which other firms would produce in a complementary way. Okay, Nokia had Symbian software, privately owned. Put it in a nonprofit foundation. They were one of many stakeholders running the foundation. They wanted to bring other partners into their ecosystem, and that was a credible way to say we're not Microsoft. I'm sorry, I didn't say that. We're not an opportunistic firm that will screw you in the long run. Back the tape up. And they ended up selling to Microsoft, which is that's the punchline. But the point is that worked, and then it didn't work because a company called Apple that does not have open source came in and it competes with a platform, Google, that's somewhat open source, and these different models are all competing. And if you can do it with programmers that are paid to work, but produce software that's not copyrighted or exclusive or has restrictive, you know, even these open source software licenses have some restrictions. I mean, they tell you what you can and cannot do. That is all nested within this property system. I mean, it goes back to some people Lockean property rights in terms of putting your labor with the productive resource and owning it. And the rights are not always respected explicitly in law, but there's a lot in the hacking community that's come out to enforce a lot of those norms. It's really quite, I mean, open source, of course, is a very interesting example of how capitalism nests competing business models. And I invite you to, in your spare time, write the next book on this to maybe, you know, update us on how those of us who are not in that community can understand how the rules are working, and between law and social norms producing tremendous value in the system in ways that are quite innovative, and that's a lot of our progress obviously depends on those innovations.
We have answers queued up here. Adam and then Christopher.
Yeah. I just wanted to just build off of the excellent comments by just saying that also with open source, 2 points. So IBM actually now has its business model completely developed around open source. And they are on record with legal filings and briefs that they have submitted, which they've gotten a lot of blowback from the open source community on, where they are actually saying we think patents are fundamental to open source. because the key feature of patents is disclosure, full disclosure. And therefore, if you get a patent on some sort of computer technology or computer implemented technology, you've got to fully disclose it in your patent. And that makes it possible for people then to be very open, because there it is on record, accessible to everyone, what it is, the thing that you have. And then, because it's your patent, you can say, go ahead and use it. I as the owner, give you an exclusive or non-exclusive license, everyone, a non-exclusive license to do this. In fact, that's property rights facilitate the private ordering, where private owners can decide, as Tom just described it, how they want to distribute their work. In fact, the AIDS virus was patented in 1984. And everyone got very upset by it until they actually asked the scientists, well, why did you get a patent on the AIDS virus? And he said, well, I got a patent on the AIDS virus so that because as the owner then, I can say it's open for use for anyone. And it was. And he said, because I can now make it open, because that's my choice as the owner of it. And then
lastly, like Creative Commons.
Yes, and then lastly, it's important to recognize open source. It's not true that there isn't property rights IP protection for open source. If you want to test that proposition, go ahead and use the Red Hat logo on something that you want to do. You'll see how fast that Red Hat believes in IP, just not patents and not copyrights. What they believe is trademark, right? Because what open source relies upon through the peer review process of the development of the programs is goodwill, and it is reputation. And that's exactly what trademark protects. And so what you see is companies and individuals create value in the world. They don't think in terms of legal silos. I'm creating patents. They create value in the world. And the point of the legal system and the political system is to provide the important protections for the nature of the value and the business model that they're going to develop upon that value. And that's why we have the different types of IP rights, just like we have different types of property rights and other types of assets. Patents, trademarks, copyrights, trade secrets. As they create the different types of value, the point is that they need to have a legal platform by which to develop a business model around that they can get the products in the market, benefit consumers, and grow the economy. And so open source is very much part of that, and it very much reflects kind of how IP generally is a platform for private ordering and incredible economic activity and growth through the insights that Adam Smith and others have developed.
Thank you. Christopher, one more comment here, and then I'm going to exercise chairman's prerogative and head off in a different direction.
Of course. And so I agree with all this. The interesting thing is three quick facts is there's a lot more mythology around open source than beliefs. First, they're not bottom-up crowdsourced. They're benevolent dictatorships under the self-description of the field. Second, it's not private volunteerism. Over 80%, if not more, 90% of the expenditure is done by private companies developing these technologies. And so there's all this weird stuff around it, but it's not really that different. And it's often hybrids, because the example I think of is Tesla, and going to David Teese's work, gave away a lot of its patents because they need complementary they need the gas stations for power. And to facilitate that complementary enterprise to develop, they needed to give away a bunch of the stuff to allow the people to practice it for free. But the more important thing that just hasn't emerged from open source theory is open source, under some people that have you believe, is it always the best mode of production for software? And we actually have very little theory about why it's good, and therefore when is it good in these circumstances and not good in these others. And so even people who are for it or against it really haven't developed it very much. And to me, that's where you really get some traction. You understand what it's good for and how to use it.
Another.
Are you opening the floor?
Yes, I was going to open the, but I was going to salt a question first. So let me do that, and then we'll turn back here. So I think what you find here is that there's wild agreement that a good patent system and intellectual property protection is key to economic growth. You know, we've seen it work. It's the way that you need to provide incentives for people to invest and protect. There are other, what I would call upstream issues, and I go back to my list of institutions. Universities, research universities, where I believe all of you draw a paycheck of some sort, have in their charter, in the U.S. at least, virtually all of them have, you know, we are in the business of the advancement of knowledge in the service of humankind. It's not we're in the business of producing intellectual property, which is then owned by companies, U.S. or foreign, that take that and create economic growth out of that. We are creating knowledge for the good of humankind. And that has sort of been the bedrock of the way US universities have worked. And it's flowed back to things like the National Science Foundation's approach to funding. The US government has march-in rights for virtually everything they fund, but I don't think anybody ever uses them. Basically, they're owned by the university. And so you have this tension between the notion that the university plays a role in driving forward the base of knowledge, which is then provided at relatively low cost to companies because we're interested in the economic development of the nation. Post-World War II, when we were the big dog, we didn't really care because we were pretty sure that anybody who took advantage of what was going on in a US university environment was going to benefit US citizens probably more than it was going to benefit citizens abroad, or at least US companies in the sort of national sense of companies. We're now in a situation where the world has changed. There's very good research going on in Chinese institutions and Indian institutions and European institutions, and it is almost impossible now to claim that the US is, you can claim that the US is in the lead pack, but you cannot claim that the US institutions are so far ahead of the rest of the world. And we're now in a situation where the charter for academic institutions basically is about open publication. My favorite example of the benefit of that from the US perspective is Larry Page and Sergey Brin, who were at Stanford working on an NSF grant when they figured out what they wanted to do with search engines. So they founded Google, and the rest is history, as they say. My assertion is that if Larry Page and Sergey Brin had been working at a German university, they would have signed a non-publication agreement with IBM Zurich and would very shortly have been high-paid employees of corporate interest because of the difference between the way European institutions work and US institutions work. So I'd like to try and move upstream in the discussion.
So what do you take from the Google example, though?
Yeah.
Because you said it was funded by NSF?
But they got a patent too, you know that.
Yeah, no,
Yes.
I'm not
How much
against,
money
I'm not
did
against
it
intellectual
go to
property.
Stanford?
That's,
Stanford took about 10% of Google.
they
No,
got,
I
yeah,
understand,
yeah.
but
But no, I don't understand. What did the NSF get?
well, no, the NSF, that's a separate issue. The question is,
thought
what
that
do
was
US
what you were
what do US citizens get?
Right.
That is, what if
Let me search. I'll search it.
what exactly. So taxpayer dollars go to support the development of knowledge for the good of humankind,
Right.
which then is captured by a company and a university together, much to the benefit of US citizens in the world. There is nothing in the structure of US universities or in the structure of the knowledge development that dictates that Google is a US company. In fact, what we're seeing now is that there's a lot of what you would call cherry picking of science and technology from US universities by companies or entities located in other locations. So what we used to be able to assume, which was that the benefits of taxpayer dollars going into research and development would benefit US citizens, we can no longer assume. And that is, it's true of university research, it's true of Department of Energy research, it's true of NIH research, and we have have I stimulated something here?
Can I just jump in for just one minor bit? You said Google's a US company, but actually what you mean is Google is a US taxpayer, because if it's not a US taxpayer, then there's no benefit to the average American, one could argue.
Employment, there's so many, what it means to be a US company versus a US taxpayer versus, it's impossible to know. But we used to be able to assume that the benefits would flow back in some way, shape, or form to the people who paid the taxes to make the investment in science. Please.
The research surplus might not all flow back, but the consumer surplus.
Yeah, it's massive.
I think what you may be missing here, though, is that sure, companies can have different foundations, and most companies now, or most major companies, are operating internationally. But what you may be missing in your discussion of, the post-war period onwards is the way in which science itself has become strongly internationalized. So US universities now can't operate in a vacuum. A lot of this knowledge development is happening across borders. I think there's some research that shows that the proportion of scientific and engineering publications that are internationally co-authored has gone up from just 1 or 2% to 30 to 40%. When I was editing the journal for main journal in the field of international business, we did an equivalent study. We found that in our field, which is inherently international anyway, the proportion of internationally co-authored papers had risen as far as 2/3.
Right.
So in other words, a lot of knowledge development now is happening through university interchanges, and all the major universities in the world have got international partnerships. So the model for knowledge development itself has become more genuinely global.
And I also think there's a difference in terms of the role. There's two realities to me. One is, I think that the idea that universities are publicly interested is a bit romanticized in the sense that we all have technology transfer offices that are patenting these technologies and monetizing them. In fact, you see across Europe, the criticism is why can't we make as much money as the US universities and within US universities? But setting that aside, my father worked at a national lab. And Roger Knoll, the Stanford economist, wrote a wonderful set of papers trying to understand, why do we have these things? And the interesting question is, as you segregate an idea of there's certain kinds of research that's done by NSF grants, there's certain stuff that's done by national labs, there's the applied science that's done by companies, because companies don't need incentives to commercialize certain things. They'll get enough benefit out of it. The reason these things exist is for basic research that is not monetarily commercially viable. And so there's never part of that calculus that it's going to accrue back to the US. This isn't just adding to the general till of knowledge, however it's going to go when you're funding that kind of research. The interesting thing is we're now seeing, the biggest thing we're seeing is a fight back against particularly medical journals who are making a fortune by charging for subscriptions on the back end and now requiring them to give some licensing on that back to the NIH, although not generally. But I don't think any of that stuff was ever really targeted towards US people particularly. It was more about pushing out knowledge. But we have, and combined with a huge agency problem we have within US universities, which is then the goal becomes to get large grants from the NIH and get the 62% overheads that you now allocate to the whole university, and becomes behaving like any other enterprise that we have. But the fact that these knowledge benefits are not necessarily accruing to the US, I don't think is a big problem.
Well,
I'm just to step back for a minute. First of all, there's massive positive spillovers from this. I mean, Google, Tom, you illustrated it perfectly. Let me search the answers for that, right? I mean, everyone benefits, the US citizens and the world, right? In fact, James Madison famously said about the patent and copyright clause, right, that this is an area where the claims of the individual and the public good completely coincide. Because the individuals who monetize their efforts and their property rights do it by deploying into the world the new technologies and services. I think your question is off because you're not talking about technology misappropriation, but knowledge in a certain sense misappropriation in a certain sense. And we don't. If we're talking about knowledge, we like that dispersed.
Except for, I think, at the globalization of science and engineering research, right?
Yes.
And the shrinking time cycles means that basically the knowledge and commercial innovation are remarkably close these days. Al Pisano, I know, is Dean of Engineering at UC San Diego.
Thanks, Bruce. I know you well. What do you think?
If you think about the portfolio of research that's going on there, how much of it would you say is, and then we'll come back to, how much of it would you say is contributing to the basic stock of knowledge in the world, and how much of it is closer to what I would call commercial application?
All right, so if I had to make a quick characterization, I would say it's roughly a 2-to-1 ratio.
Which way?
So the 2 is all the basic stuff that you need to build, and then the 1/3 of it is stuff that is just before you're ready to go off into a market. And so if the gist of it is, what do we need to do to protect our ability to do that first 2/3, because there seems to be some sort of attack on the system that, oh, you have to somehow lock everything down so someone else doesn't do something. The real damage doesn't come to the last third. The real damage comes to the first 2/3, because that's what breaks the third, the last part. And indeed, as a dean of engineering, I can assure you, many schools are under a lot of pressure, especially from the DOE and other agencies in the states, to think about how you're going to provide what I would call research security. And I have no idea, A, what that means, and B, to something that's completely anathematic to the very foundation of the system. Like, hi, I would like you to not need oxygen anymore. No, I think that's kind of fundamental. No, you don't really. That's, I think, is a key challenge facing at least the engineering side of academia today.
Yeah.
Please.
You gonna stay on this? You gonna stay on this?
But just hang on. So we all agree that knowledge is wonderful, innovation is beautiful. The basic problem of economics is how much you're going to spend to do that. Should we spend 100% of the GDP on it because it's so wonderful? Should we spend 1%? So we're having a conversation that more is better than less. But that's true not only of research, it's also true of Band-Aids, oranges, possibly even Coca-Cola if you come from the South.
Right.
So that's something to do. But the point I'm trying to make is the fact that this is all wonderful and grand and domestic or international doesn't address how much you should spend on it.
Well,
And behind a lot of it, I mean, there's security, whatever that means, I agree with you. But
When you say
beyond
how
that,
much you should spend, you're talking about the government funding?
from any source, the
Or
point is,
GDP.
all we're saying is it's better to have more and that people who are inventive invent. Hallelujah. The problem that I'm in a university which in the UK, they don't get a whole lot of money. There's no National Institute of Health in the same scale. And so you really ask yourself, how do we get money to do research? And who should put it up and how much there should be? The UK spends less as a percentage of GDP on research than the US, for example, but it doesn't matter. The point is, Economics 101, the famous subject, tells you you can't have more of everything all at once. So the fact that you're all wildly enthusiastic about more is
I'm not understanding why you say that.
well, but
I'm listening to you all extolling the virtues
Of what?
of investing in research.
well, let me
I
follow
didn't
on, because I think I think you've got an excellent point which we hadn't gotten to yet, which is this issue. In the old days, if you could count on the return to the investment in R&D accruing to the U.S. companies, citizens, tax holders, however you want to characterize it, then the arguments about more is better were pretty easy. You were going to get it wrong. You weren't going to invest enough or you're going to invest too much because nobody has a perfect algorithm for figuring out what the right level of research is. But it was on the margin because basically you were pretty sure that the country would benefit in one way, shape, or form. Now we're in a situation where, yes, there are spillover effects. It's terrific to have all of this research going on, but it's not the same as a corporate R&D model where there is an investment in return that's calculable based on your ability to appropriate. So the policy challenge, I think, in this environment, where you have different regimes, authoritarian regimes, different observation of intellectual property rights, different systems for people grabbing information from different parts of the world, whether it's intellectual property or hiring graduate students, you name it, the patterns are well known, is how much is the right amount?
So,
But
much
you're
protection?
begging the question, and I think that you're getting something. This is the point I was trying to make about our lack of theory of innovation, which is even with the spillovers, even with all these other things, we still don't know what the optimal level is going to be. And actually, I think it's worse than security. Because you can devote 100% of your budget to security. A, you'd have no product, and B, it still wouldn't be 100% secure. So we need we're asking for is a function we can optimize. Is that what we're all trying to do and to parameterize that? And I would say that the research on this has a long way to go. Because in terms of generating what the optimal level of investment in basic research is and what that's going to tie to consumer welfare and human flourishing, we're really bad at that. And so what we need to be doing is theorizing this stuff.
Well, and bringing it back to the theme of the conference around Adam Smith is that the great insight there is that you can't predict dynamic efficiency. History constantly shows that the United States in the 1830s invested in today's dollars hundreds of millions of dollars in building a canal system to transport goods. But they had railroads at that time. So why did they do that? Well, because the air brake hadn't been invented yet by Westinghouse, because the railroads were still not truly commercializable practical technologies. The air brake gets invented a decade later and instantly makes that investment obsolete. Now you could say, oh, that was a huge mistake of society and all this. Well, no, because they couldn't predict that Westinghouse would come around and make that invention, right, which would radicalize and make available this new transportation technology. So the point is, you're doing something more than assuming the disinterested spectator. You're assuming kind of a global disinterested economist, predictor of things that can make these decisions. And the point is that no, what you do is you provide a system of private rights, property, contract, tort, where people can make the independent decisions as companies, because if a company makes the wrong decision, it goes out of business. And in history, as Kay indicated, there's tons of companies littered with companies that made those wrong decisions. But that, it's not some sort of societal decision, and the government's not making the decision. It's the individuals who are making the decision, and the legal structure and the intellectual property makes it possible for you to do that.
Except for every year, somebody sets the NSF budget.
Yeah, well,
Every year.
okay.
I'd like to introduce a thought for a second, which is, it's not about the money or the amount of investment. It's about policies that are starting to put pressure on the system, irregardless of the monies. So if you have a set of government policies that say your funding your funding, whatever the levels are now at risk if you take behaviors that are not closed. We don't want to see the open behavior. That is the new existential threat that I'm trying to point out. Bruce didn't let me offer it at my time, he forced it out this time. But that's okay, we're good with that. The real point is, it's not about the dollars or pounds invested.
Yeah.
It's about this.
The regulatory overhead.
Yes.
It's both.
Well, let me
But
just,
also, if DARPA hadn't invented the internet, which they didn't quite fully understand what the use for was, like originally it was like some sort of defense thing or whatever, like the unintended consequences of so many inventions, like Teflon was not designed for frying pans. Like all of these things, the advantage that we take from them are 10x, 100x on some, and minus 1,000 on others. And we have the same problem, I'm Canadian, we have the same problem in Canada where they're trying to tie research. They say like you can't look at seal migration because there's no commercial tie-in with that. But actually, bumblebees fly in an incredibly random pattern, but actually are incredibly optimized. And now there's computer scientists who are studying bumblebees, because if you could figure out how to get the bumblebee pattern down, DHL and UPS could deliver enormously more effectively.
but just at a fundamental level here, Bruce, it's a great question, but you got two things that you're just spitting in the wind on. One, you're talking about basic research. The whole point of basic research is that it's not country specific, it's science. So of course the benefits are going to be, you got to make a political decision about what's right. There is not unlimited funding, and there can't be unlimited funding, and that's a pretty political decision, and the marginal trade-offs are going to, I'd love to live long enough to see the end of that debate, but that's where that is. The other side of this is you've got there are private benefits and a competition in the market between the universities. So, you bring up the Google example. It's absolutely wonderful to see where Brennan Page were in this whole process. Mm-hmm. Why did they go to Stanford University for computer science PhDs? How did they meet? How did they end up at Stanford? Well, Stanford broke the cartel. They were not hostile to property rights of faculty and graduate students. They were Hewlett Packard, and they were SRI, and they were lots of people get rich in Palo Alto, come here. Now, Brennan Page don't say it that way. They say, we went to Stanford to change the world. And they did, and the first check they got for $100,000 for a venture capital investment was from their professor. That's the way Stanford worked. That was controversial almost everywhere. All the universities wanted to lock this down. prior to what broke in Silicon Valley with that, and now everybody's chasing it because it's a competitive world. And are you saying that California's not better off? Stanford University's not better off? The world, yes, there are huge spillovers, but that's the competitive environment. No university's going to go back on that and tell these, you know, imagine telling faculty and students, you come here and we're taking everything.
So let me try this. We'll shift gears if we can to include the universities, but also now include corporate research. So Cambridge is a hotbed of AI. Microsoft research and Amazon research are both there with AI facilities, okay? So one argument could be, certainly if the UK was China, people would be worried that there'd be theft from the research facilities into China. Another question is, why is the UK government supporting the development of US companies? Because the UK government is investing in the development of talent that ends up working for US enterprises, and therefore the return may be primarily to US taxpayers. Or are global entities, global companies, do we expect them to have any, and this goes back to this theory of moral sentiments, does the CEO or chief technical officer of a US company have an obligation to the United States?
There's a very simple answer. There are no European companies. I'm looking right now at Mary Meeker's 2019 Internet Trends. I thought about this in the last session this morning. There are 30 top internet companies identified by market capitalization. How many are US? 18. How many are European? Number 30, Spotify, Swedish, 1. Okay, the rest are China. There's 1 Canadian, 1 Australian, 1 Argentinian, and 1 Japanese. Okay, now that's not a perfect metric, but guess what? If you're an impartial spectator and you land on planet Earth and you look around and you want to know who's getting progress right, that's one thing you might look at.
Mm-hmm.
So when I heard the discussion this morning, they're talking about how China's terrible and the United States is screwing up, and they said there's nobody on the panel from Europe. I said, oh, really? Maybe Europe is screwing up, and at least China and the United States know kind of what they're doing. Is that on tape? Oh my God! Here we go. Anyway, I'm not trying to be. I'm not really trying to put lighter fluid on it, but I do want to be somewhat provocative because, of course, they're going to work with Microsoft or Amazon. And they should. And by the way, when I go to Sweden, you go to the university in Sweden, and they say, yeah, you can give your seminar. Come to the Ericsson office at KTH, and they are on campus. And I know, it's the Erwin Jacobs School of Engineering, so there is some influence in the United States. And
He doesn't own it. He doesn't own it.
I want there to be some ownership. I think Ericsson owns part of these universities in Sweden, but I think the integration is very important because you want companies paying for the technology they're getting.
I'm not raising this as an absolute. I just think that everybody agrees on property rights as driving markets, but a lot of the intellectual property comes from government investment, and we're talking about.
I 100% question the truth of that.
Well, okay.
Because for instance, the biopharmaceutical industry, the NIH is the largest single source public funding source in the world.
Right.
$30 billion, and that is a drop in the ocean of what private R&D is invested to create those products and services. Per year, yeah.
That's a drop.
It's a drop compared to the total R&D of Pfizer, Merck, all of the companies, and then beyond that, and then in the high tech space, I don't hear about government grants going to Google or Qualcomm or all these companies. Yes, but because you could go more fundamental. The government builds the roads. So the government creates infrastructures through public finance, we don't step back and say, oh well, then that creates all these questions about who why are we allowing individuals to privately monetize this for their own benefit, and how are we trying to protect this? The point is fundamentally to allow the people who create the works to make the choice about how they choose to want to deploy it. Some want to go through open source and other types of methods of monetization. Others, because of the nature of the value, you invest $2.6 billion to come up with a healthcare product, you're going to need a patent to recoup that. You have to. I mean, Stanford made $300 million from the Google patent. What did Stanford do with that money? They turned it around and invested in their educational facilities and in scholarships and things of that sort.
This is an argument I don't disagree with anything you said. Go ahead.
Just a quick question to follow on the investments in Europe. Can anybody comment on whether a tax policy in the United States is driving the IP research centers away and outside of the United States?
Tax policy?
Yeah.
I don't know about tax
It
policy.
certainly was. I mean, there's supposed to be an adjustment.
I know, but I haven't seen the adjustment. I mean,
But
it seems to me that I don't know enough about this, but that's my speculation. Is your positioning of IP allows you to transfer a lot of value outside the United States.
There's starting to be some indirect evidence that not taxes, but actually the weakening of the U.S. patent system is what's starting to drive investments out
There are a lot of Swiss patent portfolios that are owned by U.S. based firms.
And patent's a tough one because it's national law. So where it's actually patented, even if where you develop the technology, you have to localize it everywhere you go. And so it's tough getting evidence. What strikes me more is the comment that Sam made, which is about not the direct money, but is about the other restrictions in Europe. So there's a quote, I heard it from Angela Merkel, but it's an old one, about what the difference between innovation in the US and Europe is in the US, everything that's not forbidden is permitted. In Europe, everything that's not permitted is forbidden. And in a sense, until you can show benefits, and the precautionary principle and all these things we do in Europe, puts a thumb on the scale saying, until you show me benefits, you can't do it. And that's death for innovation. Because most of it's unproven, you don't have the empirical foundation, and so the pro-innovation thing is, okay, we should backstop this in case there's problems, but put the thumb the other way. The default answer should be, you can try it unless, you don't have to get permission from anyone before you can try it. I mean, that's one of the huge differences we have, and that theoretical harms now trump theoretical benefits in an asymmetric way that's basically unprincipled.
We have, please.
Why would UK government want people to work for Microsoft? Obviously, because you get all these spin-offs. People work for Microsoft and they leave and start another business. And I used to live in Palo Alto. That's what you do. And so I don't find any of that in the slightest bit surprising. Of course, they start up there.
Silicon Valley.
Silicon Valley, exactly so. And the same thing is true of the spy agency, GCHQ in Cheltenham. It's a hub of spin-off of technology companies.
The Bayh-Dole Act in the United States is one of the great job creators.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying. I don't find it at all odd. Anyone who sets up a business is willing to support people doing R&D. It's not surprising that in the UK we think that's wonderful. We know a lot of these people will do other things. That you don't need to have great forecasting powers to figure that out. That's not a mystery to me.
Well, in the 1960s, when the support was to British Leyland, the national champions, and working with Microsoft, I think if you're at all objective, you'll say probably the more recent policy would be more in the interest of the British people.
Yeah, there's a different thing though. One of the hallmarks of British management in general is absolute incompetence and the admiration.
Well, that's not the argument.
No, this is what we're concerned with. They worship the gifted amateur at the management level in Britain. This is the explanation. This isn't a joke. This is the truth.
Yeah,
and that explains things like British Leyland, but it's got nothing to do with our current topic.
But to pivot on that little, I mean, the thing that the U.S. has that's been wonderful is the cult of the entrepreneur. I mean, we make biopics out of our successful entrepreneurs, and the social structure in a lot of countries isn't conducive to that. If you do polls in most of Europe, the number of people who think they'll start their own business is half. And the whole notion in Silicon Valley is if you're not failing, you're not trying. The idea of serial entrepreneurship is very much embedded. Whereas in a lot of places, if you try something and fail, it's an embarrassment. You wear like a badge. You never do it again. And so I think there's a huge part of it as well is facilitating that kind of a culture that is you talk about the amateurs, they were amateurs. Facebook, Google, they were all created by amateurs.
You're using the word amateur in a very different way.
I mean, that's the thing. But I don't mean to misrepresent that. But the point is, we have an openness where we have these new businesses coming in.
No, I completely agree with that. All I'm saying is the rich context is that anyone can do anything without skill. Right. This is the managerial mantra that should be carved over all the entry points to the country. No, it's something that I'm dealing with government policy and all this stuff. We really struggle with this. That's not what you mean by amateurism at all.
Right.
And
Well, I mean,
Let me, in my role as timekeeper, we've reached the end of our time.
Oh.
So let's do this. Thank you very much. Our hand for our panelists.
This is fun.